Hello, everyone, wherever you are. I know that we have participants joining us from all around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. As we begin our session, it would be wonderful for us to know who's joining us today and from where. So I see it's already happening, but I do invite you to use the chat function to please share with us your location and perhaps also the organization you're coming from so that we can build a bit of a community with our discussion today. So welcome to INQAAHE Talks. It's a series of webinars where we aim to connect our membership with broader international education and quality assurance community to discuss today's pressing issues. We bring together international experts and practitioners to share insights, challenges, best practices, and propose solutions to ensure that higher education and quality assurance continues to serve their best to our increasingly interconnected communities. If you're not yet familiar with our agency, INQAAHE is the International Network for Quality Assurance Agencies in Higher Education. It's a worldwide association of over 300 organizations active in the theory and practice of quality assuring higher education. INQAAHE offers members many services, including a journal, a bulletin, funding for projects, a research award, and of course, an annual conference or forum. So my name is Mary Catherine Lennon. I'm an INQAAHE board member and chair of the Committee for Capacity Building and Research. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada at the Post-Secondary Education Quality Assessment Board, where I'm the head of Research, International, and Special Projects. I'm also affiliated with the University of Toronto's Centre for Canadian and International Higher Education, where I lecture on issues of higher education governance and system design. Today, it is my great pleasure to chair this INQAAHE Talk session titled Indigenous Knowledge and Quality Assurance, a Global Dialogue. We are honored to have an illustrious panel of individuals from around the world who have come together to explore with us how Indigenous knowledge is understood in various jurisdictions and the significance of recognizing it in shaping a more inclusive educational framework and quality assurance practices. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Hardson Kwandai. He's the Director of Academic and Institutional Audits at the Zimbabwe Council for Higher Education. Roxanne DeLille is a board member of the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium and Dean of Indigenous and Academic Affairs at Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College in the USA. We have Dr. Stephanie Roy, the Director of Innovation, Development, and Research at the Indigenous Advanced Education and Skills Council, IASC, also here in Ontario, Canada. And Dr. Alvaro Mauricio Flores Escobar, who is a counselor at the Consejo Nacional de Acreditación, CNA in Colombia. And finally, we have Mr. Alex Bidois, who is the Deputy Chief Executive Maori from the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. Now, before handing it over to our esteemed panel, I just have a few words about housekeeping. For your information, today we have about 1.5 hours, and the structure of our session will be semi-structured conversations where the panelists will respond to prepared questions. And following that, we are happy to open the floor to the audience for questions and answers. We've muted all of your microphones to help with the smooth running of the event, and your cameras have also been disabled. But that said, we are very keen to hear from you. So please, you can use the QA function or the chat function to ask questions and inform the discussion at any time. But to keep things moving, we are going to hold the questions until the dedicated question and answer session. So please note that the webinar will be recorded and it will be made available for free access following the event on the INQAAHE webpage. Okay, and with that, I think we can begin. So I'm going to pass it over to Alex to please start things off for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and kia ora tātou, and thank you, Mary Catherine, for the introductions and for this opportunity. Hara mai te kōrero, hara mai ngā reo, hara mai te wānanga, te hihiri, te whakaaro nui me te angitu kia puta mai ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama, tihei, mauri ora. E rauranga tira mai, e hui hui mai nei, e rere kau ana ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Huiri hau o ngā waka e toru, taki timu mā tātua me te aroa, ko Alex Bidois tōku ingoa, ko au te pouwhakahaere tuarua Māori a te mana tohu mā te ranga o te aroa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. My name is Alex Bidwar, Deputy Chief Executive at the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, and I'm honoured to be part of this panel discussion today. And I send warm greetings to you all from the land of the long white cloud, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and from my ancestors who arrived in this land after voyaging across the vast Pacific Ocean many centuries ago. Kia ora mai tātou, kia ora.
Pardon me, Alvaro, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for having me and this time. Thank you, INQAAHE, for this invitation. And now I would like to introduce my part of the job that I'm doing in the CNA, the National Accreditation Council, and trying to create the design in 1995. It was officially incorporated by the means of resolution. It regulates the operation and establishes policies in accreditation, academic programs, and tertiary education institutions. Right now, we are trying to write a project in Indigenous institutions to accreditation and try to reform, increase the knowledge and methodological framework in high quality and higher education in Colombia. We are trying now to the project to recognize the diversity of the institutions and programs. And we are during these 28 years that is working in CNA, the higher education context and knowledge in academic and scientific communities. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Hardson next.
Hello, everyone. I am Hudson Kwandai, Director, Academic and Institutional Audits, the Zimbabwe Council for Higher Education, Zimbabwe. Let me greet you also in my Indigenous, Maneru, Mangwanani, Makadi. Thank you very much. I was saying good morning, good afternoon. How are you? I work with the Zimbabwe Council for Higher Education, basically in quality assurance. Our main focus is institutional audits, not to penalize, but to develop. Our audits approach are internationalized. They are meant to improve the quality of education in our systems. It's a pleasure to be with you, to share our experiences as a country, Zimbabwe, and to some extent, as a continent, so that we appreciate the African indigenous knowledge context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Roxanne.
Wadapna Marshana say Mamanito. My wanna get away on Baba Miano Ma. Usquata Mokoendago, Baba J. She Indo dem, Mashkazibin and Donjaba. Nesting the Medea. Should I not shame when a Jana? I first introduce myself formally to you. I tell you who I am in my language, and then in English, I'm known as Roxanne DeLille. I'm the Dean of Indigenous and Academic Affairs at Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. I'm also the co-executive director for WINHEC, the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium. And so I have the distinct honor of working with many really, really hardworking people who care a great deal about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of being. In that introduction, I introduce myself formally, but in that way, what I do is it's a way of sending it out and recognizing first that I ask the Spirit to look this way and see us here. That wherever you are, that we're gathered together and to see us. I also lay claim to my homeland, which is Bad River, Wisconsin. Incidentally, that's not the land that I'm on. And so in that way, what I do is I let it be known that this is not my home territory to all those spirits. That instead it's a promise that I'll walk in a good and a kind way while I'm here. This is the homeland of Anishinaabe people. However, It's not my family, my particular family's homeland. I'm down the road maybe 2 hours, eh? And so I don't want my family to think, oh, what, she's now moved over there? And I don't want them here to think that somehow I'm trying to lay claim to the place where their people are, okay, the very earth itself. And so whenever we do our introductions in and of themselves are a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge our own homeland, and in that way we acknowledge that we stand in a place that is not our homeland, and we commit to walking in a good and kind way. Thank you for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll pass it over to Stephanie now.
Bonjour, Kinawea. Wabnang Dishnakaj, Jajak Dodem, Chiging Donjba, Minidom Nising Donji, Minwa Swakamak. Stephanie Roy, Do Joganashi Nosman. Good afternoon, everybody. Like Roxanne, I introduced myself in my spirit name and the territory I come from. Mimanda and Wang Goodway Wanguzet Anishinaabe. Our existence as Anishinaabe in our territory certainly predates treaty here. I'm part of the Great Lakes Anishinaabe, and it includes Minidom Nising, which is Manitoulin Island here in Ontario, Canada. We are part of a great people belonging to the Three Fires Confederacy. So the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi people. Minidowadzuin get to go Gitam Gat Megwa Anishinaabe. Our teachings share how the Anishinaabe came to live on Shkagmekwe, Mother Earth, and used the law of the dish with one spoon, which was to share the land for the mutual benefit of all inhabitants. So I'm going to leave it there as we begin this fruitful discussion, but I'm happy to be here with my colleagues from across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being here with us today. It really is an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to the discussion. So the first question that I'd like each of you to consider and respond to is, how is Indigenous knowledge and education understood in your jurisdiction? And why is it important to recognize it within the broader higher education landscape? And I'm going to go first to Alvaro for a response, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I will say that in Colombia, for example, Indigenous knowledge and education are increasingly recognized as vital components in the nation's cultural and intellectual heritage. Indigenous knowledge refers to the accumulated wisdom, practices, and traditions of Colombia's diverse indigenous communities, which have been passed down through generations. This knowledge encompasses areas such as sustainable agriculture, so traditional medicine, environmental stewardship, and spiritual practices, often rooted in a deep connection to the land and natural ecosystems. I would like to mention two topics in this context: understanding Indigenous knowledge and education in Colombia, like cultural preservation, legal framework. The legal framework in Colombia's 1991 Constitution recognized the country as multi-ethnic and pluricultural, granting Indigenous communities the right to autonomy, including the right to manage their own educational system. Laws like Indigenous Education Law support this integration of Indigenous knowledge into formal education. Other topics, for example, bilingual and cultural education, and the importance in recognizing Indigenous knowledge. I will say that, for example, in cultural diversity and inclusion, sustainable development, social justice and equity, in this case, incorporating Indigenous knowledge to higher education, address historical inequalities and empowers Indigenous communities by validating their contributions to society. Other points, for example, the rising academic knowledge on national identity and reconciliation. In summary, I would say that Indigenous knowledge and education in Colombia are essential for preserving cultural heritage, promoting sustainability, and fostering social equity. Recognizing and integrating this knowledge into the broader higher education landscape is crucial for creating a more inclusive, diverse, and holistic academic environment. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alvaro. I'll pass it to Hardson next, please.
Thank you very much. Indigenous knowledge in the African context in general, and Zimbabwe in particular, has a rich history that predates colonial times. It includes, as said earlier on, agricultural practices, medicinal uses, environmental management techniques. These have been passed down through generations. Overall, indigenous knowledge systems in the Zimbabwean context, or Africa in general, deals with African traditions, African values, such as Ubuntu, that is caring about humanity, African beliefs such as respecting elders. It also involves beliefs such as believing in the Most High God, Mwari, Umkulumkulu. It also includes African habits. Indigenous African languages are also part of this indigenous knowledge. We can also say that indigenous knowledge in the African context includes or is embedded in the music, in the dance, in the poems. Overall, it is holistic and again, community-based. It is very important, as said earlier on. Why is it important? It is important for cultural preservation. Recognizing indigenous knowledge within the higher education system helps to preserve and revitalize the cultural practices and languages. It also helps to preserve the African identity or cultural identity. We also view it as ensuring holistic education. It means that recognizing indigenous knowledge provides a more holistic educational experience and helps students from various backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, to learn from each other. It is also a very important tool for decolonization. Recognizing indigenous knowledge in the African context is the first step towards decolonizing the education system. As said earlier on, it is critical for equity and equality, and of course, community empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
So,
Hardson.
thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to pass it over to Roxanne next.
I was going to set a timer to make sure I stay on track, eh? Well, I think what we're talking about are two different things here in the question. First of all, talking about Indigenous knowledges and how they're understood. Here in my homeland, Indigenous knowledge is deeply, deeply connected to the land itself. And it's also very much connected to the way in which we speak about it. And so you can't separate that then from that spiritual entity that is also a part of it. So even in my beginning, I ask that I let it be known that I'll have tobacco and that I'm asking to be seen in a certain way. All of this is a part of our Indigenous knowledges, that we approach things in a certain way, that we come to the discussion even in a certain way. I don't want my thoughts to be clouded over. I want them to come as cleanly as possible so that the spirit can move within it. And so I hope that you're able to hear that. So when I think about Indigenous knowledges, I think about many different things. I think about, the ceremonies that we do, and I think about the way in which we interact with the land and we interact with each other. I think that these are all critical pieces. Knowledge is seen differently. For many Indigenous people, we think about knowledge as something that is meant to be a part of our survival. I think education is thought about differently in the mainstream, and that it's meant to be a personal type of advancement. That's not necessarily the case with many Indigenous knowledges. It is instead a collective advancement, a collective survival. And so I think that everything is different in that. Now, why is that? Why is that important to understand? Just a drastic juxtaposition of the two of them together, in seeing that one is for personal advancement and one is for communal advancement. There's a drastic difference there in the way that we approach that. And why is that important? Survival. Our prophecies tell us that the people will have to turn to us, that they'll turn to Indigenous peoples on all the lands in order to survive. We are the holders. We are the ones that hold on to and have held on to all of the sacred places that exist. Wherever there is land that's untouched, that hasn't been damaged or hasn't been mined or completely pillaged, it's because Indigenous people live there and are stewards of it. We care for it. So I think that we think about it differently. And in that way, it is about our survival, but it's not about an individual survival. It's a collective survival of all human beings, of all of creation, of all those animals and bugs and, swimmers and flyers and all of them. I think that it's a completely different way of viewing it, eh? Language.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roxanne. And Stephanie.
When I look at this question, how is Indigenous knowledge and education understood in your jurisdiction? I think for jurisdiction and in the world in which I work, which is in Indigenous quality assurance here in Ontario, Canada, I think it presents to us both a unique position for us here in Ontario, Canada, in that it allows Indigenous knowledge to be included based on this Indigenous Institutes pillar here in Ontario. So when I talk about, or when I mention the Indigenous pillar here in Ontario, we're working from colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes. And I think when we understand it of inclusion in that regard, the Indigenous institutes are able to design and develop and have this inclusion. We do have this overarching and pivotal piece of legislation here in Ontario, Canada for us as Indigenous institutes, and this opens up the doors for recognition, and I call that big R. And it's in the sense of recognizing Indigenous knowledge can be and is included within the Indigenous Institute's credentials and the programs that they develop and design and send to us in QA. So I just wanted to set that context there first, because I think we're very fortunate to have Indigenous quality assessment mandate in Ontario through legislation of 2017. I think the other piece I would like to add is also that this is an opportunity for us to realize Indigenous control of Indigenous education. With that, I also want to add to what all the other participants have said, in that since time immemorial, our Indigenous people have been passing on knowledge and teachings that support the next generations and our communities in that way forward. And the challenge has been always that mainstream ways of educating have been far removed from Indigenous contexts. So I think for us with this legislation here in Ontario, Canada of 2018, Indigenous institutes are fully able to incorporate Indigenous traditions, knowledge systems, and learning into the work through their own credentials. And it allows an opportunity for us as partners, as QA partners, as Indigenous institutes, as First Nation communities, where we're able to design and assess what Indigenous knowledge is and education looks like in contemporary context in higher education. So with that, I would say that our Indigenous Quality Assessment Council makes decisions that we can all meet, where we can all meet the quality assurance goals of the sector, and where we're working towards ensuring high quality transferable credentials at Indigenous institutes that continues to respond to the needs and aspirations of Indigenous students in our communities. And I think that's the link to higher education, is that it's transferable and there's mobility there. And I think that speaks to the high quality of the QA systems that we all have within our own systems. Miigwech, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Wonderful, wonderful responses from each of you. I really appreciate the consideration that you've given and the insights that you've provided on Indigenous knowledge and education and how it's connected. So I'm going to move to our next question, which is builds quite nicely actually off of what Stephanie was just describing. And the question is, what are some of the challenges faced in recognizing the contribution and quality of Indigenous learning, knowledge, and educational practices? And I'm going to first
allow Alex to finish.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. Alex, it's your turn.
Oh, kia ora tātou. Firstly, I just wanted to make a comment then how wonderful it is listening to my fellow panelists, just to reconfirm and reinforce the commonalities across Indigenous people across the world, and how whenua, which is the Māori word for land, is sort of at that at that foundation right across our Indigenous peoples across the globe. So just wanted to comment on how wonderful it is to listen to that and have that reinforced today. In terms of the question around it being understood in Aotearoa New Zealand, just wanted to clarify, one of NZQA's roles is to independently check the quality of tertiary education providers, except for universities. So universities in New Zealand have their own separate legislation in regards to their operations. Secondly, I just wanted to advise that occasionally I'll use the term mātauranga Māori when referring to Indigenous knowledge. So in Aotearoa New Zealand, we know that there is a direct correlation between acknowledging and valuing a learner's language, culture, and identity during their education journey and achieving positive educational outcomes. Indigenous knowledge is at the core of language, culture, and identity. And we also know that incorporating Indigenous knowledge into teaching, learning, and assessment practice has benefits that extend beyond just the Indigenous learner cohort. There are benefits for everybody. As we continue our journey as an education system within Aotearoa New Zealand to embrace and infuse Indigenous knowledge, we are fortunate to have educational institutions, both our secondary and tertiary education spaces, that have forged a path for others to follow. Why is it important? Just wanted to touch on a couple of reasons. Firstly, similar to my other panelists, it's around nation building. There's a nation building imperative. In Aotearoa New Zealand, acknowledging and understanding our nation's past is vital to our journey into the future. We have a saying, te tiro whakamuri, kōkiri whakamua, which is look back to go forwards. And our system needs to continue to treasure and celebrate what makes Aotearoa unique, and that's our mātauranga Māori. Secondly, an economic imperative, the demographic profile of Aotearoa New Zealand shows that our Indigenous population is growing very rapidly. So to ensure a future prosperity for our country, we need our Indigenous people to be highly educated so they can have be productive contributors to our economy, including the very vital role of paying taxes to fund our social services. Kia ora tātou, kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And I'm so sorry for trying to skip you on that one. I'm grateful for your contributions. Okay, so moving to question 2 now. We are going to be thinking about what are some of the challenges faced in recognizing the contribution and quality of Indigenous learning, knowledge, and educational practices. And I will first turn to Hardson, please. And I believe you are muted, Hardson.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to look at 2 main challenges and then look at how Zimbabwe education system has tried to take Indigenous knowledge from the periphery to the center. The main challenge is that Indigenous knowledge has been marginalized. Indigenous knowledge systems are often viewed as, are often devalued, they are often suppressed, with a major focus on a Western-centric or a Eurocentric approach to education system. So generally, in the past, Indigenous knowledge tended to be on the periphery. And the main reason was lack of representation. So that you find that Indigenous knowledge scholars were generally ignored as if that knowledge was not the main issue. You remember in education in general, there could be division between the qualitative researchers and the positivistic researchers. In Zimbabwe, the government has introduced what we call Education 5.0. What it means is that in the past, we used to focus on teaching, research, and community service, those 3 pillars. But in the past 5 years, the government of Zimbabwe has realized that there's a lot which is happening in our cultural heritage, and therefore has introduced 2 more pillars, which is innovation and industrialization, basically focusing on the community. Our universities have found that the communities with their Indigenous knowledge are a reservoir of knowledge, which could be very useful. So universities are expected to work with communities, to work with the specialist Indigenous knowledge. For example, in the area of medicines. So we now have herbal medicines. There are some universities as we speak, focusing on herbal medicine, derived from Indigenous knowledge. So the new approach in Zimbabwe has been to integrate the Western-centric education system and also the Indigenous knowledge in a concept called Education 5.0, that innovation cannot start from abroad. It has to start within the culture of Indigenous knowledge. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hardson. Roxanne, I'm going to pass it to you next.
You know, what are the challenges? Oh my goodness, I agree with Dr. Hardson implicitly. I think that part of it is that our knowledges are seen as crafty, that they're not genuine, that they're not based in research, that they're not empirical, and that just simply isn't true. I think of the star maps that have been developed. This was, you know, time and time and time again of sitting and charting, and you know, so it is empirical. It's just seen differently. I think of our stories and all the value in these stories that were thought to be something really just kind of, well, again, we're back to being crafty or folklore, but there is so much truth in it, and there were so many pieces in there that actually led us to think about it differently. And I think that that's the most important piece, is that we think about it differently. I know a man over at Sinte Gleska University here in the United States at one of the tribal colleges, and he did a study among his elders asking how is it that we do education. And what he found was that according to his old people, that education is something that let education be in the background. The teacher was in the background and the learning took the forefront. So it was about the learning, not about what it was they were learning. It was about helping them to understand and see through their own eyes the truth of things. So there's just such a drastic difference. I think that we've been minimized. I think that where we haven't been minimized, I think that there's the danger of commodification, the sacred. That which has been sacred and is seen to be sacred has been contaminated. And I don't think that people realize the importance of keeping something pure. Okay, the genetic modification, the modification of our air, the modifications of our water, the modification, it's about modification. So again, these are just, my own thoughts on it, but I do think that there is a lot of empirical evidence to back it up as well. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. Stephanie, would you answer our question?
I think in addition to what my colleagues have responded, I think what I would add is one of the challenges that are faced in recognizing the contribution of Indigenous knowledges, I think is really the obvious, and I think it's the obvious of resources and equity, but I want to add to the point about research and why Indigenous research is so important in this area, because we know that when Indigenous research is embarked upon by Indigenous people for Indigenous people and Indigenous people, when we're able to do that, it contributes to the field and what constitutes Indigenous knowledge. So there's very important aspects there in higher education, I think, where Indigenous research plays an important part, but we're also need to be more active in that area. In addition to the importance of research, I want to also speak to, I think one of the challenges is we have to be able to allow ourselves and assert our own sovereignty as Indigenous people, and believing it, that that's the core of our existence, as Roxanne has already shared. I think the reality is that colonization has eroded many aspects of the lives of our people, and reclaiming that is a part of our healing process, and it's a part of our journey moving forward. And it's a pivotal role that our institutions play in this way forward. So I think powerful change can occur with pride and identity and knowledge systems and language and skills. And I think here in Ontario, Canada, we're very lucky because we get to move forward in the sector under the backdrop of what has become known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRCN calls to action. So in doing some of the pillar work that we get to work in, we have to be able to ensure that we're part of the sector, we're doing the work that we do, and that we are viable and credible and equal partners in the sector. So I have to say that moving forward with the work that we're doing continues to be the challenge that we're called to every day. And it's not just about the talk, but it's about the action. And my colleagues here at the Institutes in Ontario say it's not just about seeing it and acknowledging it and recognizing it. It's about the action that's done behind all the heavy lifting that we all do in the sector. So with that, I think action allows for positive change and advancement. Miigwech. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Stephanie. Alex, I'll pass it to you next.
The experience within Aotearoa New Zealand is very similar in terms of colonisation and a worldview that has come in, which has meant that our Indigenous knowledge is seen as inferior or not relevant or applicable in this day and age. Another challenge And I suppose maybe an opportunity within the challenge is that we have a number of institutions that have a desire to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, but the challenge for them is around capability and capacity. And so I think that's a challenge right across our system within Aotearoa New Zealand, but one where potentially our Indigenous institutions could be funded, could be supported to provide sort of guidance and advice to other institutions. I mean, one way that my organisation is attempting to inform and influence the system is to capture and share examples of where tertiary organisations are embedding Indigenous knowledge into their learning programs and achieving great outcomes. So we collect this data and evidence, we publish the reports and encourage organisations to use the insights to potentially change their practice with the aim of developing a community within the tertiary institutions so that they can safely reflect on reflect on where they are in their own journeys and how they might improve their practice for the sake of all of their learners that come along to their institutions. We are blessed to also have wonderful examples, particularly in our secondary compulsory education system, where a number of our schools are founded on Indigenous knowledge systems and pedagogy. And again, data and evidence shows that they outperform equivalent mainstream schools within the system. And so within their system, they have lots to offer, and the system generally has a lot to learn from their experience. But transferring over from that secondary space where we've got lots of great practice, and for the tertiary space also to learn from what's occurring earlier on in the education journey of our learners. Kia ora, thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Alex. Pass it to Alvaro next, please.
Thank you, Marie. Well, I would say that recognizing the contribution and quality of Indigenous learning, knowledge, and educational practices faces several challenges in Colombia. These challenges stem from historical, cultural, structural, and systemic factors. I would like to mention, for example, the historical marginalization and colonial legacy. For example, in case of cultural erasure, the dominance of Western education system, like us in Colombia here, led the marginalization and the indigenous language, traditions, and knowledge, creating a perception that the indigenous practices are inferior or outdated. In the case, for example, in the lack of institutional support, for example, in the resources constraints, Indigenous educational initiatives often lack adequate funding, structure, and institutional support, limiting their ability to thrive and recognize it. The policy implementation gaps. It is the case on the laws and policies may exist to support Indigenous education, like in Colombia, with the Colombian's 1991 Constitution. It has been 34 years in implementation and it's taking too much time. We will say that now the new system, educational Indigenous system that is in the going forward to implement, I think that is a good way to try to recognize this Indigenous education. The other challenge is possible to lack of recognition. I think that Indigenous knowledge is frequently excluded from the mainstream curricula, research, and academic discourse, leading to us to under-evaluation. And the other point, for example, in cultural misunderstanding, not Indigenous educators and policymakers may lack of cultural competence to understand or appreciate the depth of the value of Indigenous knowledge system. And the context of standardization and assessment challenges, I think that diverse knowledge system, in this case, for example, Indigenous knowledge is often context-specific and holistic, making it difficult to fit in standard education frameworks and assessment methods. And the quality recognition, this is the other thing that I could mention. There is often a lack of criteria to frameworks to evaluate the quality of the Indigenous knowledge and educational practices in ways to respect the unique characteristics. In summary, I will say that by addressing these challenges, societies can better recognize and value the contributions of Indigenous knowledge and educational practices, leading to a more inclusive and equitable educational landscape. Thank you, Mary.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great contributions from everyone. Thank you. It sounds like a lot of your contributions touched on similar themes. We heard about the need to move from Indigenous knowledge from the periphery to the center, about capacity building of individuals, educators, about building community, and ensuring the recognition and the valuation of different ways of knowing and understanding. So thank you so much for all of that. I'm going to move quickly now to our third question, which is actually a really big question. This one is, how do we create the space for meaningful integration of Indigenous learning, knowledge, and educational practices into quality assurance and system level recognition practices? It's a big one, and one that I think that our community here as quality assurance professionals is quite keen to think about. So Roxanne, I'm going to pass it to you first.
Well, first of all, I am one of the co-directors at INQAAHE, at the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium. And so I think that we need to develop our own. I think that we need to develop our own quality assurance and be, acknowledged for that. I think that we're capable of doing that. I think that we have enough educated people in both worldviews to be able to do that. I think the difference then between, for instance, our accrediting bodies here in the United States, we call them accreditation bodies, is that they have a standard, they have a standard that we are supposed to measure to. Where within our own quality assurance, we ask from INQAAHE, from the perspective of INQAAHE, we ask, who are you? What do you do? How do you do it? And how is this Indigenous in nature? Okay. I think that is, something that can be recognized as being clearly on par with any other quality assurance. We have the capacity to evaluate our own, define it, be it, and prove it. Okay, and that's the same as any other quality assurance. I think that's our real challenge, though, is defining ourselves to once again claim who we are. I think that we have the right to be who we are. We have the right to the knowledge that we have. And the hardest part is standing in it and claiming it. And then fighting for it, arguing for it, that it is enough, that it is valuable. I like what Stephanie talked about, that we need to be contributing to the research. Show that we are. Okay. But the ones really that we should be showing is us. I can't evaluate Maori people. Maori people need to evaluate what is Indigenous education. I don't think that we can internationalize it in that way. I think that it has to be very distinct and very unique to each people as we claim this knowledge that we hold. We hold so much. There is not an Indigenous peoples that's not holding a wealth of knowledge. Okay, so I think the hardest part is the standing in it, claiming in it, and being careful that we haven't allowed it to become too corrupted. Okay, we have become assimilated. There's just no denying that. We are blended. But where do we take from that the richness that is us as well? Okay, Miigwech.
Great. Thank you so much, Roxanne. Stephanie, I'll pass it to you next.
I think for this particular question, in terms of how we create the space for meaningful integration of our knowledge and our educational practices into a QA, into a quality assurance system, recognition practices. Again, as I stated, I'm going to say it again, that we're very fortunate in our area, in our territory here in Ontario, Canada, because we are recognized through legislation So as an Indigenous Advanced Education and Skills Council, we have the ability and the flexibility to create established standards and benchmarks for programs across the Ontario qualification framework. So from certificates through to diplomas, post-diplomas, and degrees. And in those submissions that Indigenous institutes are able to submit, those can also include those institutes from those Indigenous communities for their Indigenous learners. Their own cultural standards are able to be included, and they're able to demonstrate and include their ways of knowing and being and doing and relating in those program submissions through the standards that are created in our applications. So with that, you know, there's still the ability to demonstrate and submit and be flexible in making sure that that inclusion happens. And I think because we're in the field of QA, all of us, I think we all recognize that the uniqueness we have in our jurisdiction is recognizing that there's the ability to include Indigenous learner outcomes along with essential employability outcomes and vocational learning outcomes across the framework that we use here in Ontario. So I think for us in working with our partners, you know, it's really about collectively how we work together, we roll up our sleeves, and it's about designing and developing the programs that are responsive to community needs for the learners within our communities, and really ultimately contributing to nation building, as was mentioned by my colleagues. So I would say that we have a rigorous process of program applications, and that they're culturally relevant. And I think that's the defining piece, is that we can make them as distinct as the communities that they're coming from within each of the territories of Ontario, Canada. And then lastly, it's really important because, again, I mentioned already, learner transferability. So whether they later go to a college or university, that's certainly able to factor into consideration as they have learner mobility with students across the sector in higher education. Miigwech, thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Alex, I'll turn it over to you next.
Oh, thank you. In terms of one of our roles within the New Zealand Qualifications Authority is to manage the New Zealand Qualifications and Credentials Framework. So this framework is an important tool to assist in the positioning of Indigenous knowledge, Mātauranga Māori, alongside other knowledge systems. It's important that that framework creates space for Māori knowledge, Māori worldviews, and the Māori language to be included in qualifications and credentials. Over a decade ago, we collaborated with Indigenous stakeholders to create an Indigenous quality assurance approach that tertiary institutions can opt to use when they engage with us in the quality assurance space. And at the heart of that approach is 6 kaupapa, or principles, that guide our evaluative conversations. And those conversations about what quality looks like in the educational context of the organisation, how the organisation knows that it's meeting the needs of learners, their families and communities, whether the organisation has sufficient capacity and capability to deliver and sustain the educational outcomes, and how well the organisation reflects on its delivery to improve its overall educational performance. So saying that approach is, in my mind, sort of a genuine attempt to apply a Māori worldview, concepts from Te Ao Māori within the quality assurance space. The next exciting step, alluding to what Roxanne has talked about, is we're starting to have conversations with our Indigenous tertiary institutions around actually how do we provide the autonomy for those institutions themselves to define and to demonstrate quality in their own context, in the context of the world that their learners come from, that their communities come from. And again, that sort of links back to what were those aspirations and hopes from their ancestors, from centuries before. How do we work alongside as a crown, as a government agency, work in true partnership with those Indigenous institutions to provide the space for those institutions themselves to design what quality assurance mechanisms they see as important. Kia ora, thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Alvaro.
Thank you, Marie. Well, I will say that for create this space for meaningful integration of the Indigenous learning in Colombia, we need three things first to start in this way. It requires thoughtful, respectful, and collaborative approach. This is, I think, the best top three aspects that is necessary to recognize this integration of Indigenous learning. In Colombia, right now, is working in the new law to propose to create the Indigenous education system. Since 2023, this group of people, Indigenous communities, are meeting and is now established a purpose to develop the Indigenous education system as a state of educational policy to guarantee Indigenous education and educational autonomy based on worldview, laws of origin, major law, our law of each Indigenous people, and within the constitutional framework. This is a good start in Colombia to start to recognize the Indigenous knowledge. The other thing it is important to recognize the value of the Indigenous knowledge system, addressing historical inequalities and creating structures that honor and validate Indigenous ways of knowing. And also, I think that may be important to recognize the holistically, this Indigenous knowledge, the deeply connected with the culture, to the language, the environment, and to respect as equal to Western knowledge systems. We also need to decolonize quality assurance frameworks in case that the standards criteria that is the Western, we have to ensure that quality are inclusive and flexible enough to accommodate diverse knowledge systems. I think that this is important for educational autonomy. In this case, the right that Indigenous peoples must create, decide, organize, implement, manage, and administer their own Indigenous education for their millennial survival as peoples. And their first step, the systems of government and dynamics of these Indigenous people will prevail. And the other point, our educational administration in this autonomous exercise of organizing, directing, developing, managing, executing, and assessing the Indigenous educational process of our Indigenous educational system. In summary, I would say that by centering Indigenous voices, respecting cultural protocols, and adapting systems to inclusive educational institutions and quality assurance bodies can create a space for meaningful integration of the Indigenous learning and knowledge. This not only enriches the education, but also this contributes to reconciliation and the revitalization of the Indigenous cultures and language. Thank you, Mo.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And now I'll pass it to Hartson for the last word on this question.
Thank you very much. In the Zimbabwean context, basically, we are now talking about what we are doing, how space has been created. As a quality assurance agency, the Zimbabwe Council for Higher Education has developed with the universities what we call minimum bodies of knowledge and skills, MBKs. It means that every program, if it's a BSc chemistry, 80% of the content and the skills expected are uniform. The 20%, universities should look at what they want to do, which is unique. And that uniqueness, in most cases, is derived from the indigenous knowledge, is derived from the cultural heritage. Because within any given environment, universities are unique. So therefore, they have to engage the communities, including indigenous communities. They have to have inclusive curriculum so that within their community engagement, the various groups, including the indigenous groups, in addition to academics, they have to be included. We also encourage research and publications in the area of indigenous knowledge. A good number of our academics who may also be in this webinar are researchers in the area of indigenous knowledge. The participants may want to know that our environmental policies, environmental education, they do embody indigenous knowledge. So we are happy that overall, within government policy, within the curriculum, within the quality assurance agents, the issue of indigenous knowledge has been taken aboard. And we are happy because it's playing its role in medicine, environment, and other sectors. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, sorry, thank you. Sorry, I lost the screen for a second there. Just wanted to say thank you so much. I appreciated everyone's contributions on this topic of how we can really sort of harness Indigenous knowledges and education into the quality assurance practices and into that credential system, and recognize the credentials in the education. And it sounds that your thoughts regarding defining and demanding clarity on the role of Indigenous education, the need to design and formalize standards and expectations, and sort of the articulation of Indigenous education that's culturally relevant but also clear is something that I heard. And the need for a thoughtful, collaborative approach in developing these activities. So I thank you so much for all of your contributions on that. We are going to turn now to open questions and answers, and we've had some in the chat. And to summarize, I guess they're in the Q&A section. And when I was having trouble getting back to the screen, it's because I was reading through them all and trying to see which one I think would be a poignant one for us to address. So many of them are addressing the same themes that I'm going to try to do my best to sort of summarize, I think, the sentiment of them. And it's the notion of internationalization and globalization of higher education as sort of a norming factor for higher education that supports the recognition of credentials across the world, student mobility, labor market mobility, etc., with the reality of the locally based, culturally relevant Indigenous knowledge and programming. So I guess I would love to hear your thoughts on the sort of the pulls or the tensions maybe between internationalization and indigenization of higher education and quality assurance. And I don't have an order for you, so if anyone would like to go first, please. We can do it by hands if that's easy. Oh, I see Roxanne. Thank you.
I'm the glaring extrovert in the group, so I guess I'm the one who doesn't tolerate silence as well. You know, that idea of internationalization, I think that I always think of my uncle and how he spoke about there's a thread that runs through all philosophical systems, and that there is a thread. There are similarities to many of Indigenous ways across the globe. Hey, I think that we do see the land in a very similar way. I think that we do recognize the spirit in a similar way. I think we see holistically in a similar way, and yet it's similarity. And I think that that's as close as we might be able to get. Even for goodness sake, Dr. Roy and myself, we're both Anishinaabe, but we're going to have very different worldviews because we come from a very different location. And so I think that we have to leave space in there to be very careful, hey, that we don't commodify and we don't blend and blur to extinction, that we are mindful and thoughtful of the contributions, the unique contributions of those from different lands. But I think that our Creator puts us in a place so that we can capitalize on learning from our own epistemological place, eh? That suddenly, I think there's room for that. I know that I have seen that in traveling internationally, the similarities that now trigger me to think in a different way, but still through my own lens. Okay, so I think that there's a value in recognizing the common, and there's also a danger in that we blur. And I think that that's the most important piece in my way of understanding, is that we keep that uniqueness. Without that uniqueness, then there's no new learning. If we all think the same, if we all feel the same and be the same, there is no real new learning to happen then. So those are just my thoughts on it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Please, I invite the rest to contribute. Hardson?
Yes. In my view, the two are not dialectically opposed. I see them as complementary. In fact, if we look at how Zimbabwe has looked at its quality assurance, the MBKs, the minimum bodies of knowledge, I talked about 80%, 20%. So we can actually talk about 80% as internationalization, because a graduate in physics has to operate internationally. At the same time, we should not lose focus of our indigenous knowledge. We should not lose focus of our roots. So in my view, I'll function more effectively when I try to bring the two together and blend them. One, to be international, at the same time, not forgetting the indigenous, the roots of our lives, the belief system. Thank you.
If I can just add, just in terms of absolutely agree with the other two panelists in terms of their comments. I think one of those other similarities is respect. I think Dr. Hudson talked about respect for elders, but I think that respect also extends beyond that, and I think that's another similarity. I touched on the New Zealand qualifications and credentials framework, and certainly one of the roles is that sort of the esteem of a higher qualification, in terms of transportability. If learners from Aotearoa then travel overseas and beyond, is that that framework provides a tool in terms of a comparison. So if you, and if I apply an Indigenous perspective over that, that's, I suppose, one of those other challenges that if in one of our Indigenous institutions, a learner went through and completed his doctorate degree, that doctorate degree is equivalent, and I would argue even higher esteem than an equivalent in a mainstream university setting. But I think that's still one of the challenges that still need to be overcome, is that parity of esteem between an Indigenous institution and maybe what's perceived as one of our mainstream institutions. So I, like Dr. Hudson, absolutely see it as complementary, and ensuring that that lens, as Roxanne was saying, it's having those commonalities, but applying that unique lens that come with your own traditions, passed down from those ancestors that we have. Kia ora. Thank you.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I think I just add another quick point to what my colleagues have shared. I think when we look at globalization and indigenization, I guess, in a global, in the world that we work within, quality assessment and assurance, I think for me, it's really understanding that I think there's many similarities that we have as Indigenous people. And I think some of the similarities speak to some of maybe the universal principles that many of our Indigenous cultures have. And, those universal principles can be respect and kindness and stewardship. There's lots of those universal principles that we have within our cultures and how those teachings are given to us as a people. But I think when we look at indigenization and the role of indigenization, I believe that we have that unique responsibility given to us to be able to, and only us to be able to indigenize our own systems that meets the needs for our people. So I think when we talk about indigenization, it has to be done within the context of our local context that we all live in our parts of the globe. And I think that when I look at indigenization from an Anishinaabe perspective here in Ontario, Canada, it's very distinct for how we do things within our systems of knowing, doing, being, and relating. And that's done as a collaborative effort of a community, and it's not individual. So I think there is a distinct difference, and I think there's some very universal principles that we can collaborate on, and maybe some universal even standards in terms of how we value our own knowledge systems and apply it for the relevancy of our territory that we live in. So I would say that indigenization can only be by the people that are residing within that territory. Miigwech. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Alvaro, do you have a comment on this one?
Yeah. I was thinking about Colombia because it's not, it's starting new system, and the policy reform right now is working on trying to recognize the Indigenous education. So this policy reform advocates for policy changes on institutional, regional, and national levels to support the recognition of the Indigenous knowledge. So we are starting to recognize this and respect this importance of the educational in higher education. And in assessment, we are trying to, as CNA in Colombia, to recognize the diversity of the institutions. And this is what we're working on. And this was the starting point right now with the law. We're expecting that the law is finished during this year. It's possible that we're starting to do a new system to recognize and cooperate with them about how to recognize our quality assurance in higher education. So I think that this is the work that we're having now in Colombia during these 2 years. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know that each of the panelists are able to access the questions. And if so, I invite you, if there's one that you feel like you would particularly like to answer, please do. Or perhaps there's something that we haven't addressed yet that you wish to take a moment to bring forward to the conversation. We have not very many minutes, but a few minutes for sort of an open conversation. So please take the floor, and if you're concerned about jumping in on someone else, you can use the raised hand function. Please, I invite you to speak up.
I tell you, extroverts, you can count on us, huh? I think I like the question from Elias. I hope I'm saying that right. From Zimbabwe. Looking at how can INQAAHE be evaluated without imposing Western standards of validation and reliability? I say determine what is your standard, and then live to your own standard. I think that again, I am so much I think that we have the right. I do. I think that we have the right to claim our own standards. I think that we have the right to say that this is the bar, this is how it's done, this is how it should be done according to our tradition, and then evaluate it on that. Then there are, the Western classes, of course, that we have to take that are evaluated, based on a Western standard of, pass or fail, or, the degrees in between. But when it comes to courses that are strictly about Indigenous knowledge, I think that we have to define that for ourselves first, and then rise to the very highest of that standard. I think that we have the capacity to do it. I think the hardest part, though, is the defining, because we have become somewhat blurred a little bit. And I think that once we have that definition in mind and what is the purity of that, then it's easy. Once you see a target, you can aim for it.
Thank you, Roxanne. Anyone else? Nothing burning that needs to be shared. Okay. Well, that's absolutely fine, and that keeps us on track, in fact. So what I'll do now is I will give my closing remarks, and then I would like to pass it to each of you for your closing remarks, if I can do that, and then we'll conclude. So, oops, let me find just a couple of notes just to say thank you. Thank you so much for your valuable contributions to our conversation today. Your breadth and depth of knowledge and expertise and insight into this topic area has really demonstrated the challenges, the successes, and the opportunities for incorporating Indigenous knowledge and education into our systems, into our quality assurance practices, and into the global higher education conversation, because I think we all recognize the value that it brings. So on behalf of INQAAHE, thank you to all of the participants for joining the sessions. To the session, your questions and comments have been great and helped us to create an engaging session. And we hope that this session has been valuable to you in your work. I know that each of the panelists would be more than happy to hear from anyone who would like to reach out and further discuss any of the issues that have been raised today. Finally, I'd like to remind you that INQAAHE will be hosting I think it's the 18th or 19th biannual conference at the end of May, or the middle of May this year. It's the Big Bang Theory, the quality assurance paradigm shift. It'll be an in-person event in Tokyo, Japan from May 13th to 16th, and we do hope you will join us. So as always, INQAAHE is here with you and for you, so please reach out and do keep in contact. And then with that, Stephanie, I'm going to pass it over to you for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Catherine. Mary Catherine. I just want to say miigwech. Thank you to all of my esteemed colleagues who have joined us today from many parts of the globe. I learned from every one of you. Thank you to our participants who have joined us as well, and taken your valuable time to be able to have this important discussion. about Indigenous knowledges and our systems in higher education and quality education. With that, I want to give a closing in my language, and this closing is very important to our people on Manitoulin Island. So I'm going to give the close and then now give you a brief summary of that. Mimanda Enwang Goodwe Wang Guzit Anishinaabe. The Benjagat Gisan Anishinaabe and a king. Give it a good God and am in it all Watsawin. Shkuda Nebe Ake. Norden. Give it a gustonan. We nog the wind when Mompishkok Makong. Zogedwin, Debwin, Nodendwin, Wakawin, Badendiswin, Quadzawin, Mino, Akadewin. The Benjagat, Gimino, Dedwinwe, Nogdwendwin, Come Nada Nana, Gabishwebug, Mino, Nangwa, Egwe, Ezrebug, Mino, Megwa, Gabe, one Ezrebug, Miigwech. I just said that we are one large family. The Creator placed us on this earth. He gave us the gift of sovereignty and spirituality. And here on Mother Earth, we're given the gifts to govern ourselves and given the responsibility to look after fire, water, earth, and wind. And then I said that we respect the past, the present, and the future. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was lovely. Alex, I'll pass it to you next, please.
Well, kia ora tātou. Again, just wanted to acknowledge all of you who have joined us today. Thank you very much. Acknowledge you, our wonderful chair, Mary Catherine, for your work this morning. I suppose in terms of a final comment, and I think it's resonated throughout our kōrero, our discussion today, is that Indigenous people have a guardianship role over Indigenous knowledge. And therefore, it is right that only Indigenous people are able to define what quality around that Indigenous knowledge looks like. And the challenge for people like me and the roles that I have as being part of the government is to look for authentic ways to truly partner with our Indigenous institutions, to create that space for our Indigenous institutions to define what quality assurance for them looks like in their context. So that's an ongoing commitment for us as an organisation, and that work is for the benefit of all that are fortunate to call Aotearoa New Zealand home. So kia ora tātou.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Alvaro, would you like to say some final words?
Yes, of course. I would like to thank everyone to join us today. It's a very, very good experience. I learned too much. As you can see, we are starting, it's not advanced like Canada, like other countries that are starting with new accreditation systems in Indigenous communities. So I think that is a very, very good experience. I would say that in this case, in the growth of education in Latin America faces, there is too much pressures right now for technological changes, economic development and globalization. So these pressures create too many obstacles that prevent the full realization to promise the expansion, the high quality. And the Indigenous education maybe is the one of these that they have to take care from this complexity. So various Indigenous communities and leaders have to advocate to establish our higher education institutions to preserve, to respect, incorporate their cultural values and knowledge systems. I think that is the time to support, to empower Indigenous people to become leaders and defenders of their rights. I think that this is the time in Colombia that the Indigenous people try to reach our own expectations and go forward to reach their own education system. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much. Pass it over to Hardson next.
Thank you all for listening, and thank you, colleagues, for your contributions. Greatly appreciated. This has been very useful in terms of learning. I do believe that Indigenous knowledge has a role to play. In fact, if we're time, we're going to refer to what happened during COVID-19. In Zimbabwe, both Indigenous people and Eurocentric went back to Indigenous medicinal herbs, which made wonders, meaning that Indigenous knowledge does have a role to play. And we can create space through collaborative works, inclusive curriculum, inclusive policies, and let's give a voice to the Indigenous knowledge systems and ensure that as academics, we do research, we do publish. It's an exciting area with a lot of promise. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hudson. And Roxanne, I'll pass it to you.
You know how scary it is that you let me be the last one? Because I don't have to worry about anybody that I'm imposing on their time. But
There we go. You got 3 whole minutes, all yours.
I so tease. I can't thank you enough for honoring me by being here. My esteemed colleagues, I appreciate you. I hope that there's nothing but kindness and beauty and gentleness in your lives. The work that we do is hard work. As we continue to support the notions of Indigenous knowledge, it urges us, hey, we are called then to really be thinking about what does that mean for us? Where do I need to shore this up a little bit in my own life? Where do I need to seek out additional, little pieces that will help me to be a better human being? Because I think that at its core is the purpose of why we exist, is to be a good human being within our own realms, eh? So I really want to just offer my thanksgiving and my gratitude for being here, and be that I'm a cheerleader. Hey, I like to rah us into recognizing that we are beautiful. We are beautiful. We are generous, and we are kind, and we are giving, and we are sharing, and we have shared everything. Everything of us we have shared. Okay. And so as we think about that, then the reclaiming of what belongs to us, hey, we still don't take it back completely. Hey, we continue to share in that way. And so I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that our Creator bestowed upon us such generosity and this gift, hey, of being able to stand in it. There are many of our people who are not able to stand. And I think about them and I send out my kind and loving thoughts to them that they might find voice, and that they might find the courage, and that they might find the legs even to stand in this hard time that we live in. Here in the United States, we are in a very hard time, okay, for American Indian people. And it's challenging. And yet, we are so gifted, and I think to find the gift inside of the challenge will be the greatest of our work. To find that gift, there's a gift inside that challenge. The greater the challenge, the greater the gift. Miigwech, miigwech, miigwech. Thank you.
My deepest gratitudes to all of the panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. To our participants, thank you for joining us. Please keep in touch, and I wish you all a good day, a good evening, and good night. Thank you. Thank you.